If you look at the various intelligence arguments that dealt with so-called links between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, we have now an Inspector General's report from the Pentagon to show again that that was based on phony intelligence, specious intelligence, and in one case, intelligence that was obtained through the use of torture, in which the Libyan agent who gave this intelligence to the Egyptians recanted after he was released from prison. It turns out all of this material that he gave to the Egyptians that was then passed to the United States, that became the case for war, was gotten through torture and abuse. The issue of the mobile biological labs was from an agent, an Iraqi defector, who the Germans handled, who went by the name Curveball. Screwball would have been a better pseudonym for this particular character. The Germans who handled him told us he was an alcoholic. They couldn't rely on any of his information. There was no verification for any of this information. He was an extremely unstable personality. Nevertheless, this material played a big part in the speech that Colin Powell gave to the UN in February of 2003. So if you go down the list, every piece of material that the government used and that the White House used was essentially specious material in one way or another. That's why I've always objected to those people who frame the question as, did the CIA misuse the intelligence, or did the CIA give intelligence to the White House that was then misused by the Bush administration? It's not an either-or question or answer. It's a both-and kind of answer. The CIA handled the intelligence poorly, and the White House, in just about every case, made it a lot worse. Now, why is it important that we get this problem right, the problem of an intelligence organization, particularly a secret intelligence organization inside a democracy? And I maintain that it's still important to get it right. Others, I remember the late Senator Daniel Moynihan, argued for doing away with the CIA. And I still think that the day after you had abolished the CIA, another organization will reappear with the same kind of mission, that you do need an intelligence agency. Now, if you look at the 60-year history of the CIA, I break it into two periods. A 30-year period, which was essentially the golden age of CIA activities, in which they acquired more power to conduct covert action over the years, and provided some pretty good intelligence support of arms control negotiations, and as I said earlier, even gave the Johnson administration and the Nixon administration reason to believe that their policies could not succeed in Vietnam. But beginning in the mid-70s, you have a period of crisis in which there are at least three major periods that have to be looked at briefly. This would be the period of the 1970s, and the scandals associated with the CIA, particularly during the Vietnam War, that led to infringement on civil liberties, the reopening of mail, the mail of American citizens, the monitoring, illegal monitoring of anti-war groups during the Vietnam War, policies of assassination that had to come to an end and did for a significant period of time. At least this period of crisis, which was exposed to us, fortunately, because we had an aggressive investigative reporter who won a Pulitzer Prize for his work, Seymour Hersh. This period was at least confronted with investigations on the Hill. The Senate really did their job, and so did the House. You had the Church Committee hearings and the Pike Committee in the House. And out of that came the oversight process, which did not exist until the mid-1970s. So from 1975, 76 on, you had the Senate Select Intelligence Committee and the House Permanent Select Committee. And for about 15 years, I think they did a decent job of oversight of the CIA. You have also had the Hughes-Ryan Amendment, in which the administration had to do a finding for any covert action and submit that finding to the intelligence committees for their approval. And in 1979, the Carter administration was responsible for an important reform, the Intelligence Oversight Act of 1979, in which you gave a little more power to the oversight committees to conduct exclusive oversight of the intelligence community. In the 1980s, you had another crisis, and of course that was the crisis of Iran-Contra. And I think we know more about Iran-Contra if so many people, including CIA officials, hadn't been pardoned by George Bush the elder right before he left office in 1992. But out of that crisis came the statutory IG Act of the late 1980s, in which for the first time the CIA got an inspector general appointed with the approval of the Congress of the United States and having statutory privileges that the inspector general did not have before. In other words, the ability to really investigate problems and illegalities at the Central Intelligence Agency. This didn't exist before the late 1980s. What is unusual about the period we're in now is, once again, we're in a terrible period of crisis. You have the CIA committing crimes, indeed committing war crimes. When we look at the secret prisons that existed in Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia, the use of torture and abuse in these prisons, and there's still an exemption for the CIA that came out of the terrible Military Commissions Act of 2006 that allows the CIA to conduct practices that we know nothing about. In fact, if you look at the recent confessions that were released to the press, they were redacted to remove the descriptions of apparent torture tactics that were applied against these al-Qaeda captives at Guantanamo and other places. And then, of course, you have the unconscionable policy of renditions and extraordinary renditions. Renditions is the ability of the CIA to pick up terrorist suspects in one country and bring them to the United States. This is bad enough. What is even worse is the ability that the CIA has to pick up these suspects in one country and then deliver them to a third country, where they're bound to be tortured. These people are turned over to intelligence services in Egypt, in Syria, in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, where we know torture happens regularly. We know nothing about these people in the wake of this transition of authority in this act of rendition. And we do know, thanks to a very courageous reporter for the Washington Post, Dana Priest, who wrote an outstanding article about the case of al-Nasri, the German citizen, who was rendered from Macedonia to Afghanistan, tortured in a prison in Afghanistan. And frankly, if Nasri hadn't been a German citizen, I wonder if he ever had been released. Because once it was known that they were holding Nasri falsely, the fact that he was a German convinced the White House that we had to do something about this and release this guy. The CIA had been doing nothing to get him released from the prison, the secret prison where they had placed him. There's the Canadian citizen, Rar, who was rendered from JFK Airport to Syria, where he was tortured. There's the case of Abu Omar, who was rendered to Egypt, where he was tortured. And now this case is leading to legal action because now the Italian government has indicted about 24 CIA officials for their role in the extraordinary rendition of Abu Omar. So there are these terrible cases that journalists are dealing with and foreign courts are dealing with, but our own Justice Department has refused to deal with. And this is going to have to be dealt with. So why do we have to get this right? I think the case that can be made for intelligence is best made around the issue of terrorism and all of the uncertainty that terrorism has introduced into the international arena. The intelligence failure I did not discuss in looking at a review of the problem of intelligence failure was the 9/11 failure. Some people deny that 9/11 was an intelligence failure. I feel by definition that any time this country is attacked, no matter what the scenario, and there is no strategic warning of such an attack, you have by definition an intelligence failure.